Good morning, folks. My name is Drew Ashar with the ISO Stakeholder Affairs Group. Thanks so much for joining us today to discuss the energy storage and distributed energy resources Phase 4 final proposal for the default energy bid, or DEB proposal. And we, of course, hope you are staying safe and healthy during all that is going on with the current events out there. So thank you so much again for your time and engagement in advance. For today, as you can see, we'll discuss the final proposal, which also includes a discussion on the stakeholder feedback received since the last iteration. Thanks again to those that contributed, of course. And then finally, we'll discuss any next steps prior to the board. This, as you know, is also a simple display of our stakeholder process, throughout which the ISO obtains input from stakeholders in between each proposal iteration prior to carrying it forth to the board for consideration for approval. In addition, the calls and webinars are recorded for stakeholder convenience, allowing those who are unable to attend to listen to the recordings after the meetings. The recordings will be publicly available on the ISO webpage for a limited time following the meetings. Of course, the recordings and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. And lastly, of course, if you have any questions, please raise your hand virtually by pressing #2. We encourage verbal questions only. If I see any chat questions, I'll be sure to verbalize them for folks if needed. And we please request that you state your name and the company that you represent. And without further ado, I'm hand it over to Gabe Murtaugh, who will be leading the presentation. Also joined by Bridget Sparks, Jill Powers from our Market Infrastructure Policy Development Group, and Bill Weaver from our legal group. And with that, I'll hand it over to Gabe.
Thanks, Jimmy. I appreciate it. Good afternoon, everybody who's on the phone. Thank you for dialing in and joining us today. As Jimmy noted, we are talking about the ESDR initiative, and the specific item that we're discussing is the storage default energy bid. Just as a very brief reminder, we did initially take this element of ESDR 4 out of the ESDR 4 initiative, and we continued to work on it over the last few months, primarily so that we could consider feedback that we had received from the Market Surveillance Committee on two distinct items, and that's what we're talking about and discussing here, is essentially the changes that we've made from the ESDR 4 final proposal here in the final proposal that we've included in this documentation. On that note, I do have a calendar up here on slide 4, and that just sort of points out exactly where we've been with this initiative. We did post the final proposal for the ESDR storage DEB on October 22nd. Today is the 29th, and we're having the stakeholder meeting to discuss that final proposal for the storage DEB. We have a due date for comments on November 12th, and then we are planning to take this to the EIM governing body at the very early dates in December, so just about a month from right now, and then we'll take the full policy for the storage default energy bid to the Board of Governors in mid-December on the December 16th and 17th Board of Governors date. We are still planning, and we announced this when we split these off from the ESDR 4 policy, that the target implementation date for this and all of the other items that were covered in ESDR 4 would be done, or we're targeting to have them done in fall of 2021. So we should expect this to be in place at that time, and we will be discussing that when we take this to the ISO Board of Governors in December. Okay, so getting into the policy here, Jimmy, you can go ahead to slide 6, please. Most folks on the call will recall that the initial policy did include a description of a new default energy bid formulation that could be applied to storage resources. We did, as mentioned, we received input and feedback from the Market Surveillance Committee that outlined, well, the feedback itself was actually quite lengthy, and it focused on a number of items around storage default energy bid, and a lot of the discussion was sort of how you would frame a default energy bid in an ideal setting. However, they did make mention of two things that were very actionable for us to do. The first was, update and bifurcate the default energy bid into a formulation that would be applied to the day-ahead market and another one that would be applied to the real-time market, and just make a note that in the day-ahead market, the opportunity cost adder that we had anticipated including in that formulation wasn't necessary. And the reason it wasn't necessary is because of the nature of how the day-ahead market works and the optimization. Essentially, the only time the day-ahead market would schedule a storage resource to charge and discharge would be on a day when the price spread between those two charging and discharging events was sufficient to cover the operational costs for that resource, plus the cost to actually purchase the energy in the first place, which is one term that we've included in the default energy bid. And it wasn't necessary to include the opportunity cost in the day-ahead market formulation because the calculation would automatically schedule those charges and discharges in the hours when that spread was the greatest in an effort to minimize total overall cost to the system. The other thing that was noted and that we expressly noted and that we heard from stakeholders was that it is critical to include these opportunity cost adders or components of the default energy bid in any formulation of the DEB in the real-time market. And the ISO is completely behind this. We are still anticipating leaving this component in the default energy bid that's going to be applied for resources in the real-time market. The reason being is if I have a 4-hour battery and I know that prices for a 4-hour block are going to be $100 per megawatt hour or higher later on today, I certainly wouldn't want to discharge my resource now at prices where I wouldn't have the ability to recharge later because I know that at any price that's less than $100, because I know that I can get $100 for that energy at a later time of the day. So even if prices were, say, $95, if I didn't expect prices to dip down lower later, I would still not want to sell energy at 95. I'd want to hold it and sell the energy later in the day at 100. And again, the real-time market is only looking ahead 1 hour, 13 real-time RTD intervals at any point in time and not the full 24 hours, which the day-ahead market is looking over. That was the first change. The second, and we included that in the draft final proposal. The second change also included in the draft final proposal was to exclude small, quote-unquote, small storage resources from being subject to the ISO market power mitigation logic tools. The rationale given by the Market Surveillance Committee here was that, well, these small storage resources really, generally are going to have very little impact on market prices. Their ability to actually exercise market power is relatively small just because of how small the resources are themselves. But if we mitigate these resources too often or we mitigate them to a default energy bid that's too low, this could have major implications on, recovering costs for these storage resources. So because of these two reasons, both that they're likely to have a small impact on the market and because over-mitigation really could have large implications for their, financial viability, the ask from the Market Surveillance Committee was to just simply exclude small storage resources. They also included language that said, well, they have to be small storage resources and they also have to have an ultimate parent that's not a net supplier. So they have to be a net buyer of energy because they wouldn't want, a net supplier sort of purchasing a lot of very small storage resources and then effectively exercising market power that way. Yeah, both of these were outlined in the draft final proposal. We did have a discussion about that in the last conference call with this group. We also received stakeholder feedback on that draft final proposal. And I think, and we'll talk about that in the next slide, but I think the reactions were largely mixed. You know, we didn't hear exclusively to not do or to do either one of these two particular items. So at this point, the ISO is proposing to move forward with both of these changes, and we included that in our final proposal, which was just published a week ago, and then we are going to take that proposal to the EIM governing body and the Board of Governors meeting. So if we advance to slide 7, this just sort of outlines some of that feedback that we heard from stakeholders on this initiative. I would categorize the feedback as mixed on these two items. We heard it from a few stakeholders that both of these changes were fine and we should move forward. We heard from at least one stakeholder that we should not move forward on either of these. And then we heard from other stakeholders that one of these two was appropriate, but not necessarily the other one. And some of them said number 1 was appropriate, some of them said number 2 was appropriate. So really a mixed bag across the board. I think some of the larger issues that were brought forward, mentioned by stakeholders in those comments, were concerns about accuracy issues with the charging costs embedded in the default energy bid that we've included here. I think, to a certain extent, the ISO agrees that charging costs are difficult to estimate, and I think we really worked hard on this categorization of the default energy bid so that it would be something that would work for most resources. I think for some of the sample data that we included in the ESDR 4 final proposal, it included an example of a resource and how frequently that resource would be dispatched under the specifications that we had. And under those, under that historic data, we found that resources really weren't dispatched very much more than 4 hours per day that infrequently. And I think even though we might not have total accuracy on what charging costs might be for resources, like occasionally they could be higher than what we estimate, most of the time this default energy bid that we're formulating here isn't going to be overly burdensome and effectively discharge resources too frequently. Now, if any resources sort of take issue with that and say, well, no, this isn't really going to work for my specific storage resource, we do continue to have the negotiated default energy bid where you can come in and explain how your costs are working for your resource, how a formulation would be constructed to more accurately model the actual cost that you guys have for your resources, and then that can be applied to your resource. The idea here with this default energy bid is that it's something that's prepackaged that can be used right off the shelf, and you don't have to go through that negotiation process, and ideally it would be applicable to most storage resources. So we do appreciate, and I think this goes for a lot of these comments, that there could be some potential accuracy issues, but we've tried to do some testing and looking at historical data to sort of verify that this default energy bid would work going forward. And I think we've constructed something that we feel comfortable with. So we also received a comment from market participants saying that that the market participants might be better able to predict when high prices are going to occur in the real-time markets, and thus a default energy bid that sort of forces them to discharge energy is maybe in some ways unfair. I certainly wouldn't say that our day-ahead or real-time markets are perfect. There certainly are likely times when there are issues and things going on that the ISO doesn't anticipate, and it might be the case that market participants really do have a better idea about how prices are going to be formed in the real-time market compared to the ISO. There's nothing stopping resources from bidding in actual bids into the markets at higher prices during hours when they feel like they don't want to be dispatched. This default energy bid is only going to be used when market power mitigation is triggered. And again, I think we've done the checks to make sure that this is robust enough so that it's not distorting dispatch often or too frequently for these resources. And then finally, again, if these resources do have an issue with any particular resource and it's not, market power mitigation is triggering too frequently, these costs associated with this particular default energy bid aren't high enough to cover costs for these resources, we certainly can get a negotiated default energy bid for any of these resources. Opportunity costs for the following days period should be included in the default energy bid. The ISO hasn't really formulated a good mechanism to estimate these costs, and they may not be necessary. I think we're continuing, and this was also feedback that we heard from the Market Surveillance Committee too. So it is something that we'd like to consider thinking about. We don't really have a formulation to include, opportunity costs from the successive day in today's calculations. I think, if this is something that stakeholders really feel strongly about, I think if somebody has an explanation of how this calculation can work, I think we could entertain this potentially in, future stakeholder initiatives where we're looking at this default energy bid. But again, at this point, I think we're relatively comfortable with the formulation that we have, and we're not inclined to include these additional opportunity costs, notwithstanding the complications of potentially trying to estimate what those might be. Just seeing as we've, had and discussed some of the difficulties of assessing what the opportunity cost would be for the same day. I think for the next day it gets even more complicated and tenuous. But again, if stakeholders have something that might be able to express how this works, we're happy to consider this in potential future stakeholder initiatives. The other feedback that we received, and again, this was something else that was touched on by the Market Surveillance Committee, is that costs to buy energy may not be necessary in the day-ahead market. The logic follows very similarly to the logic for the opportunity costs that don't need to be included in the day-ahead market. And I think, the ISO appreciates this. We also appreciate that, we discussed this particular bullet item in a workshop that was, I think, back in January. And at that workshop, we explicitly went through some of the pros and cons of including this or not including this. Now, maybe in light of the MSC opinion, it might be worth sort of circling back and reevaluating. But I think at this time, we don't necessarily feel comfortable that a default energy bid without these values would be sufficient in all cases. So we're inclined to keep this in place. And again, this is just commentary on feedback that we did receive from stakeholders. So before we move on, I'll stop for questions, but I would just add that we have made one small change to the formulation, both in the day-ahead market and the real-time market for the default energy bid, and I'll go through that on the next slide. But really, if anybody has any comments on the two proposed changes that we outlined in the draft final proposal and potentially issues with the ISO moving forward with those, I think we can address those now. Or if folks want to add anything to the discussion on the comments we received, that's appropriate at this time too. So, operator, do we have any calls in queue at this point?
There is one person in queue. Please go ahead.
Hello, Gabe. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can.
This is Alvis Svoboda at PG&E. I had two comments or objections to the direction that you've moved at, and just wanted to make them as well as perhaps questions along with those.
Mm-hmm. So
I think that the basic objection that I see to the idea of that you've decided to exclude the cost of an estimate of discharge value essentially from the default energy bid on a daily basis is that previous formulation could be much more responsive to general changes in price. I mean, basically you have three components of the default energy bid: the charging cost, the variable operating cost and the opportunity cost for discharge. And the charging cost and the opportunity cost for discharge represent expectations about prices in the daily market, essentially. They're the ISO's expectations and the market participants' expectations. And they serve as the way in which market participants would be trying to control their bids to get some behavior out of the resource that they want to see from the market. Aside from whatever the ISO might want to do with the resource, they have their own desires, and so those elements allow them to represent costs of charging and opportunity costs on discharge. Now, your argument in the past has been that middle term, the variable operating cost, which is a negotiated amount, is going to cover essentially the opportunity cost. Essentially, when you add the variable operating cost to the charging cost, you've got something that is on average going to be higher than that value that you would need to put in for the discharge cost. And so, therefore, you're essentially covered for bidding in that way, and you're not going to get mitigated to a point that won't allow you to implement that strategy. And I think that's really only true in an environment where you don't have changes that can't be captured in that variable operating cost term. The variable operating cost term is a static term, so it doesn't capture things that happen to prices over periods of weeks or months, or even from one day to the next. I think that's one of our basic problems with your reliance on that as the term that is going to protect, bidders who want to essentially represent that opportunity cost in their discharge bids. So I think there's we just have an objection, or I have an objection. I'm not speaking, we've made comments to this effect, though, from PG&E's side, to the idea that, you're not going to allow that kind of responsiveness to actual prices on in the default energy bid. Now, that is somewhat covered by also, and this is the other issue I have with this. It's somewhat covered by, you've made statements before that you're essentially going to accept a variable operating cost, or in other words, an arbitrage on the order of $30 without any concerns. However, I can't rely on that statement. There's nothing in the proposal. There's nothing in the tariff. There's nothing in anything you've said that would lead us to know that you will, in fact, have some level of variable operating cost that basically covers all reasonable scenarios of how prices might essentially materialize. If you are going to formally say we're going to accept a default variable operating cost of $30 on batteries, then I think essentially, certainly we're protected, and maybe you've given market participants too much leeway that way, but at least market participants are covered for what might actually materialize in prices. But the way I anticipate it is just the opposite. Your default is going to be zero, and you're going to require some form of justification for a variable operating cost on batteries, which is really based on the expected lifetime and how the battery is expected to behave over its, proper operations over its lifetime. And that value is actually very close to the opportunity cost for following periods, which you're refusing to even consider calculating for the following day, let alone for the next 10 years. So I don't know that it's possible to depend on your being willing to accept some value for that variable operating cost that we might assess as, say we assess that it's going to be $15, and you say, what's the justification for that? And we give you some numerical model that we've run that shows that $15 causes the resource to be operated the way we think it should be operated for the next 10 years. Is that automatically going to be enough for you to accept $15, or are you going to say, well, that doesn't, there's no physical basis for that. You're back to zero. So I'm very concerned about this framework that you've set up for the default energy bid.
Yeah, thanks, Alva, for those comments. I appreciate that. Excuse me. One thing I think I would say is that, you're right. We haven't come out and specifically said, yes, we would accept a blanket, $30 or less would automatically be approved for the variable operations cost. You're absolutely characterizing this correctly, that you would have to come to the ISO and justify what those variable costs would be. Now, I think what we have said and what we've included in the documentation is that, we might not be surprised if we see these values at around $30 per megawatt hour, and those are kind of some of the numbers that we've heard from, resource operators and from public literature that's out there on operations for these resources. Now, I think part of what you're saying is accurate. We haven't gone out there and specified a specific ceiling at which any value below that number would automatically be approved. But at the same time, I think we have recognized that we don't assume that these costs would be de minimis. We know that a large, for lithium-ion storage resources, which is a large tranche of what we have installed, or most of what we have installed on their system, these resources will need things like cell augmentation, and that can be extremely expensive to the tune of basically replacing what the initial fixed cost was for the battery infrastructure for these facilities. And I think if you can, and I don't, I'm not saying that our hurdles, or I'm hoping that our hurdles won't be overly onerous, but I think if you can justify that, hey, look, we're anticipating running our resource, ballpark 1 cycle a day, or maybe a little less than that, and running at 1 cycle a day, we expect to have cell augmentation in X number of years, and then thinking about those costs averaged over the lifetime of the resource, that should get you a number on a dollars per megawatt hour basis, which is really representing the wear and tear on the battery as it occurs, it's charging and discharging, and that number should be used for the variable operations cost component of the default energy bid. Now, I do have I have a little bit of a concern following some of the logic about the opportunity costs for prices in years down the road. I don't know that I'm totally tracking with how those should be included in default energy bids today. And then I'm certainly confused about how the ISO would go about developing a model to anticipate what those prices would be. I think there's a lot of, when you start looking out, years in advance, I think there's a lot of variability in, what the expectations would be for in terms of like pricing models. I think today a lot of what drives our pricing are, external gas prices and how those move, and thinking of making assumptions about how we think that could change in the next few years might be a bit of a stretch to try to determine some opportunity costs to include for storage resources. And in the meantime, if we are procuring these resources for resource adequacy, it is to provide capacity to the market and to charge and discharge, and that's sort of the behavior that we generally expect from storage resources. Now, on a daily basis, if the primary function of the opportunity cost was to serve to prevent the resource from being discharged too early in the day.
Also from being discharged too many hours in the day, on some average basis. If you can say, well, on one day you're going to get the market's going to dispatch you 6 hours or 8 hours, but you can't have that happening day after day.
So are you thinking about the situation where you might get discharged 2 hours in the morning and then 4 hours in the evening?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, the kinds of, looking at price-driven optimization of a battery, you see that, depending on, if you don't have an opportunity cost for the energy and you're just basing it on some fixed variable cost and the charging cost, you're going to see potentially that the variable cost is too low to prevent you from charging on average 1.5 cycles a day, for example. And prices just materialize that way. And so for a year, you're running at 1.5 cycles a day, or maybe for multiple years. How do you, you're expecting some value, and which I think the way you've described it is quite onerous to provide information about, unless you're going to provide, sort of default information about what you think replacement of cells is. I don't think that's something that should be, necessarily involved in the calculation of this variable operating cost on a battery-by-battery basis. But, you're going to have situations where the battery is cycling. Yeah, exactly, 1.5 cycles, and that's kind of the default that I've seen. And just looking even at the prices that we've had in the market in the past couple of years, we're not talking any. So assuming prices look on in kind of on a charge versus discharge basis, they look similar to what they look like now. You're going to have batteries that are going to be cycling in the morning and the evening, and you're going to not have any way to control that from happening if that is something you don't want to see. There may be other reasons that people don't want to see 1.5 cycles a day, but the assumption is, yes, they want to stick to 1 cycle a day, and you're not really providing any way to limit that. It's not the issue of you're being dispatched in the wrong hours. I think your point is well taken. Yeah, the Market Surveillance Committee, that you will find the 4 most valuable hours, or you'll find the X most valuable hours based on a given set of bids. But it's that number of hours is going to be on average more than, and we as operating the Helms power plant, have seen many cases where the ISO has no way within the market to control the cycling of the pump storage plant. They'll use it excessively because that's what happens, and unless you have some more control on that side of it, on the actual discharge side, you're not going to have any way to restrict CAISO from being able to and not even CAISO, the market algorithms from over dispatching batteries.
Yeah, let me see if I'm tracking this, Alva. Let's just suppose that I have a storage resource, lithium-ion battery, and I'm assuming that if it cycles once per day, that the variable cost associated with that resource running is $20 per megawatt hour. But and I think that's what you're saying. But if I bid in the resource to say, well, if I see buy prices plus $20 and sell prices that are higher than that, I'm going to go ahead and dispatch the resource. Now, when I go into the day-ahead market, what that does is it charges the resource in the morning, it discharges them for 2 hours in the morning, then it recharges the resource, and then it discharges for 2 hours in the evening. So now instead of cycling for 4 hours, thanks. Now instead of cycling once per day, you're actually cycling 1.5 times a day. Now the initial basis of that $20 per megawatt hour was from an estimate of cycling once per day. Now the language that we've included in the documentation says you can give us your cycling costs for more than once a day. And I think we've said, okay, maybe for cycling once a day, those costs really are $20 per megawatt hour. But if you're cycling twice per day, those costs suddenly jump up. And even if you're just a little bit over once per day, like 1.2 or something, you might be more in the range of $40 per megawatt hour. Well, in that case, we'd really prefer to get, and I think this is what we say in the paper, to get that $40 per megawatt hour as the term that we're using for the variable cost component of the resource. That way, if we do cycle the, and that doesn't mean it has to be. But you
backed yourself into a corner a moment ago, because that can only be based on a picture of prices. That's not based on a replacement cost for that difference between the 20 and the 40 is not based on the replacement cost of the modules. It's based on the value. That's the only way we can assess whether we need to put $20 or $40 in.
Well, that may be the case. In previous discussions, I think what I have heard was that resource owners can measure the cost to operate these resources, and they know what that cost is, and they know what the cost is for cycling once per day, and these are specifications that are received and agreed upon from the manufacturer. And then if that resource is to cycle more than once a day at like 1.1 or 1.2 or 1.25, then those costs suddenly jump up. And the understanding by myself was that those costs were also understood, and it wasn't sort of a mystery what would happen if this resource suddenly did start cycling more than once. And that was part of the reason why in the final proposal for ESDR 4, we included that to say that, cycling more than once a day would be allowed for the variable operations costs that were submitted to the ISO.
Well, I don't really think that the costs are understood necessarily in that way, but it's possible that they are. Even if they were, the question of whether you're cycling once a day or more than once a day is based on how the market actually materializes. And so basically, and this is not, so essentially if you think that you've put in a price based on a cycle a day and then you find yourself cycling more, this is not a responsive way to deal with that. You have to go through a new process of justification. And even if it only takes a month to do, you've lost a month of how the batteries operate. This is not your bid parameters. What you're talking about with the variable O&M cost. And we have no predictable time involved. I mean, we've worked with you on many master file fields where we've had to go back and forth over the course of months. So I don't think for dealing with things that are happening in the market, that just saying you can change your variable operating costs, if it turns out that that what you expected is not what you're seeing in the market, would be a reasonable way. Looking from a perspective of market design, it's not a reasonable way to deal with that. I understand that you're saying there is that recourse, but I just think it's a very simple remedy in my mind. Your original proposal of saying that you're going to look at both the charging costs and the discharging costs. And, the premise is that either of those values will be a control on how much, dispatch of the resource happens in the day. And it's a perfectly fine control, and it's one that responds on a daily basis, as based on your forecast of prices or your calculated value and based on the resource owner's forecast of prices. And it is going to float in the right direction as prices change. Even if it's not exactly the right value on any one day, it's going to move in the right direction. If the value of the top 4 hours of the day doubles, your ability to put in a bid to keep yourself at one cycle a day, if you so choose, is going to double. Whereas with the approach right now, any change in the value of discharge will not be allowed to exceed some cap, and that cap could be set based on information that doesn't that only barely covers your costs of charging and, as you say, replacing the modules. So I think it's a very cumbersome way to control you're bidding under conditions of where market conditions are changing and maybe changing again in the future quite a bit.
Yeah, we might be talking past each other here. I certainly understand that this formulation is not the formulation that you would prefer to see, and I do appreciate that including an opportunity cost in the day-ahead formulation could give a little additional security in terms of the formulation of the default energy bid. I think the one thing that I would sort of kind of circle back to here is that we would not expect a resource who's setting up this default energy bid to select the cost that corresponds to one cycle per day. We would expect them to give us their cost if they were cycling more than once per day. And that would be what was included in the default energy bid. And the other thing is that, these are default energy bids. These aren't, and the only time that these are used is when market power mitigation is triggered and the actual bids from the resources are higher than these default energy bids. So really, this is meant to be an upper bound, and bids in the market, for a profit-maximizing resource may be considerably less than this in both the day and the real-time markets. Yeah,
but suppose you put in a number for 1.5 cycles a day, and then you end up getting cycled twice a day. Why should we? Or maybe are you suggesting, like I've seen under certain cases in certain months of the year, we're being cycled almost twice a day based purely on energy arbitrage. And remember, we're not looking at any ancillary services, but you have, even because you basically have more hours to charge in the middle of the day, and you can be cycled more than 1.5 times a day. You can be cycled essentially almost twice a day. Suppose that system conditions, that's kind of an extreme case of conditions for a 4-hour battery. I mean, there's no way you're going to get more than 2 cycles a day.
Yeah.
But if that's the worst case,
I agree.
And you base your variable operating cost on 2 cycles a day, you've automatically doubled your variable operating cost or something like that, because the way I picture the use of the battery is you get half as much use of the battery if you cycle twice a day. You're able to use it over half the duration as you would if you're only cycling once a day.
Sure,
you have to replace all the components in 5 years rather than 10 years. So,
I agree with that.
I guess that's probably what we will do is try to figure out what's the replacement cost, as you say, of the modules, assuming that you're going to get cycled twice a day, and then that will be the value we would expect to get. I still think that you're missing one element, which is that if the difference between prices in the day ends up being quite a ways off of what you had anticipated, you may still get the dollars that you're putting on that may not represent what the dollars that are available in the market are. I mean, so you've made an estimate of what they're going to be worth, and suddenly energy in the peaking hours is worth a lot more a lot of the time than that value had assumed. And I mean, I can't quite put the scenario together because you pushed me to saying, well, let's assume you've got 2 cycles a day, and that really is a worst case. So I guess I have to think about it in the way that you're presenting it, which is you can factor in what it's actually going to cost you to replace the modules, assuming you're cycling twice a day, and that's what we're going to assume is the variable operating cost that you're allowed to put in. So assuming that's the approach, I think you're going to end up at that point with default energy bids that have so much, the discharge cost is going to be So the upper bound is going to be way above what you'd normally need to recover your, arbitrage costs and variable costs. And so, I mean, I guess if that's the approach you're taking, then that's not so unreasonable. I think I'll take that back, and we'll assume that what we're trying to figure out is what's the variable operating cost, assuming that you're causing the battery to be cycled more than once a day, basically twice a day. The only other point I would raise is how flexible is this method once you get to batteries that have 6 or 8 hour cycling? Are you going to be able to essentially allow the same thing with batteries that have those longer cycles? And I think at that point you do run in also to the following day use being a very important part of the anticipated value of a battery, and so you have to be thinking about that a lot more. Anyway, thank you very much, Gabe. I appreciate all your feedback.
No, thanks for those comments, Alva. I think those are really important, and it does, it's not necessarily, focused on everything that we're doing here in the changes. I think it does harken a lot back to the proposal that we had in the ESDR 4 initiative. But I appreciate the dialogue, and I do think you raised a lot of really good points that we have worked through to some extent, maybe some items more than others in that policy. But I think it's nice to sort of recap this in a holistic way. I'd also agree with you that those following day opportunity costs, or even following, maybe not even day, maybe it's week or month opportunity costs, will start to play a factor in the decisions for that longer duration storage to make charge and discharge decisions. And what I expect to happen is that this policy that we're writing right now isn't going to be the final say on how these default energy bids are constructed. As you noted, I think, if we do start making assumptions like, these resources are going to cycle twice per day, we're going to include those costs in our variable operating costs component for the resource. They are relatively loose, and I think it would be good for the ISO to sort of circle back at some point and take a look at what actual bids are for resources and see what we can do to try to make the estimates of these default energy bids a little bit closer to actual realities. And then, yes, thinking about how we expand this in the future to think about future operating days or for longer duration storage is going to be really important, but not something we're taking care of right now.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Alva. Operator, any other calls?
Yes, there's one other person on the line. Hi, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi. Thank you very much for, I thought that dialogue was great, and I appreciate the opportunity to have a stakeholder call and ask some of our questions. We just kind of recapping, I appreciate the summary of the stakeholder comments. Ours included a lot of clarifying questions. And just kind of throwing it out there that I'm sure some others did as well, that maybe another category would just be, there's obviously always the devil in the details, right? And I'm sure that those will get explored further in more of the implementation phase, but I did appreciate the opportunity to provide some of those questions in the comments, so I want to say thank you for that.
Great.
Yeah, thanks. Directly, I'm glad Alva brought up the discussion about the variable operating cost and what the default is, because that was one of our kind of additional comments that we submitted. So from Vistra's perspective, we're trying to get up to speed on both the moving pieces of what CAISO is, what you're discussing here in this effort, changes to policy for the variable operating cost for storage, while at the same time there's this variable operations and maintenance cost review stakeholder process going on. So yeah. I'm looking at these in parallel, trying to make sense of them. My assumption has been that this variable operating cost that you're talking about in your work is in the process for establishing it at the CAISO is leveraging the existing request to establish a custom operations and maintenance adder that you have today. Is that assumption correct?
No, this is going to be a new default energy bid that can be elected alongside the pre-existing default energy bids. The VO&M initiative is really thinking about adders that are on the variable cost default energy bid. So that's a pre-existing DEB specification.
Yeah, and just kind of following up on that, and so when you're referring to this new negotiation process or consultation process with the CAISO for establishing the variable operating costs I see here, what is that process? What are you anticipating that process to look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think an operator of a storage resource that would like to use this default energy bid would go through a process where they would submit paperwork to our market data and validation team, and that team would review the request and likely have like a follow-up consultation on it to review some of the data. But basically, that information would just be submitted to the ISO. I think it's through generally the city ticket system.
Yeah, and I appreciate that additional detail. And the reason I'm asking, kind of asking a couple different ways, is that sounds a great deal to me like the existing process where you submit a city ticket, request a custom O&M, provide supporting documentation, and you go through a consultation. So just trying to get a better understanding of, are these really different processes, or are they the same process but would feed into different DEB formulations?
Yeah, we're using the same tools to effectuate two different processes.
Great. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Yep.
And so one additional follow-up on this, we just kind of nailing down the difference between these two. So in the BOM cost review process, that approach is, that proposal is saying that storage doesn't have any operating costs across any of, even in an energy opportunity cost. And the table that is provided shows it as no, and the next report, explains why that's an attachment to that process. I just want to confirm that all of that documentation, all of that is details that would govern a request for a custom O&M that would be in the standard. And I think what I'm really struggling with is this paper clearly says that there's current principles being proposed that storage doesn't have an energy opportunity cost. And then I'm looking at this, and I just want to make sure that they're not in conflict with each other and how we should be able to track them being aligned.
Sure. Yeah. And I was involved in the VO&M process, that stakeholder initiative. But essentially, you're right. The idea behind the VO&M initiative is that the ISO wanted to go through and set up sort of default or threshold levels of variable operations and maintenance costs that would be automatically assumed to be okay for those variable cost default energy bids that those resources were using. So, that process went through and looked at different technology types of resources and said, oh, for this tech type, we'd assume anything that's less than, I don't know, $3 per megawatt hour to be acceptable. So if somebody comes to the ISO and says, oh, my costs are $280, we just go ahead and plug that right into their calculation. Or if they said, no, mine are really $4, there'd be a process where they'd negotiate that $4 and show why their $4 was what their actual costs were. And to the extent that the ISO could validate it, we'd use those submitted information instead of whatever the default value was that was being established from the stakeholder initiative. This initiative, completely separate, we are setting up a new default energy bid that would be available to storage resources only. And if you were a storage resource, you could elect to use this default energy bid. And part of this default energy bid comes with a component that includes the variable cost to operate the storage resource. Now, in the VO&M initiative, they did call out storage resources specifically and say, yeah, I think you're right. They did use a $0 per megawatt hour as the default adder for the variable cost default energy bid, which is not this default energy bid. But I think the reason they did that is they just don't have any data on actual operation data for storage resources, or not much at least, to base kind of a standard or a automatically approved safe harbor range for storage resources on. I imagine in the future, as we get more storage resources on the system, we will have a safe harbor for storage for the variable cost default energy bid, but we just don't at this point.
Thanks, Gabe. The way that I understand and I'm very comfortable with the existing processes for establishing the O&M through negotiations and having that documented in the master file. And I appreciate that your emphasizes it is different DEB. It's different DEB formula, but the way we see it is it's a different DEB formulation, but the input for the variable operating cost could either be a default, which would be no, according to the BOM cost review, or a negotiated, which we call the custom O&M, right? And that's documented and saved in the master file once it's successfully negotiated. While it's a process detail, I think it's an important one, and would just respectfully ask if the CAISO if could take it back and consider providing some of this additional detail, if not in the policy phase, at least being proactively including it in the DRS.
Okay, yeah, thanks. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. I do have an additional comment I wanted to make on the specific changes that you proposed in the last iteration of your proposal that you described. Vistra supported the change to take the opportunity cost out of the day-ahead DEB formulation and appreciates the CAISO taking the MSC feedback on that one. I think that's an important and positive change to the proposal. The second recommendation from the MSC, though, to exempt small storage or less than 5 megawatts, I do have some concerns that imposes some differential treatment for those resources that are below 5 megawatts versus even storage that is above that threshold, or even non-storage that are less than 5 megawatts. It brings us very complicated policy questions about is there any preferential treatment going towards this class of resources versus the others that you might be able to argue fall into the same kind of causes that you were mentioning, like the non-storage, less than 5 megs, right? That's similar to, I think, the rationale you're describing that might not be able to have as adverse of an impact on the market. The other thing I can see is that if a 6 megawatt resource is going to be subject to mitigation, we picked this threshold. Is that now unduly, is that now providing some kind of disadvantage or harm to that 6 megawatt resource? It just becomes very complicated. And I would like to hear some more about your rationale for adopting that proposal. Before I do want to share with you that I completely sympathize with the issue of there could be over mitigation, and with the way the DEB is formulated, and that could have an adverse impact if storage resources are overly mitigated. I think that applies to the larger storage, the 6 megawatt, the 10 megawatt, as well as the 3 megawatt ones. But I also am a little confused why the existing mechanisms in place to mitigate that concern, the frequently mitigated unit adder, wasn't the preferred option to address the concern raised. And I was hoping you could provide some more detail.
No, I mean, I think you're right. I think this rule does give preference to, exactly like you say, those 5 megawatt resources and not the 6 megawatt resources. So there is some bias in treatment for resources there. I do think that this was a recommendation from the MSC. I know that they've raised similar recommendations in other venues for other initiatives, but I think just because they did make this recommendation and we felt like it was reasonable, that's why we adopted it. And, we do understand that we're going to have to defend this at FERC.
No, I appreciate that, yeah. And it is certainly, it brings up a lot of issues and a lot of questions, and I'm sure there will be additional discussions. I just would, in our written comments, we asked for this clarity, but just to reemphasize that frequently mitigated unit adder was introduced to the CAISO rules specifically to address concerns with over-mitigation. And if you are over-mitigated, including that frequently mitigated unit adder, is a currently accepted just and reasonable approach to do that? And if this exemption you want to propose as an addition to that, we can continue that discussion once it's in a FERC paper docket. But before that, I just would, we respectfully ask that the CAISO clarify that FMU adder is available on top of the storage DEB like it is for every other DEB option.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the specific details of that particular adder, so yeah, I can't comment on that right now.
I understand. I'm happy to, if you would like to circle up offline, I'm happy to talk about it further. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, operator, do we have any other calls on the line?
Not at this time.
Okay, let's go ahead and press on then. So the next slide, we should be on slide 8 here with the formulation. We did receive, I think in the last call we had with stakeholders when we were discussing the draft final proposal, we did hear some verbal comments on the formulation of the default energy bid with negative prices for energy, and we also received comments on that in the written comments. And just as a reminder, we did, let me just see, I've just got a couple things going on here, sorry guys. We do have a formulation for the default energy bid that includes, as we were just talking about, the energy costs and losses, the cycling costs, and the opportunity costs for the resources. The final formulation that we've come up with and the augmentation is the day-ahead storage costs would actually have this maximization formula where if energy costs or expected costs to buy energy were less than $0, we would just use $0 instead, and then we would use this rho value, which denotes the variable cost to operate the resource, and then we'd apply the 1.1 multiplier on that for the day-ahead storage default energy bid. For the real-time storage default energy bid, it would include an opportunity cost calculation. Again, that would be the fourth highest hour of default energy, of expected prices in the real-time market, which would be an output from the day-ahead market, and that would be applicable to a 4-hour storage resource. It would also impose a floor for those energy costs at $0. Part of the reason for the ISO wanting to include this in the final proposal is, we understood the comments that we got. If we had a negative energy price and we had the 1.1 multiplier applied to the negative energy price, that would actually push the default energy bid in the opposite direction as we would typically expect the 1.1 multiplier to push the values. Because of that, and because we, relatively infrequently see negative prices for expected buy prices for energy, and when we do see them, the magnitude tends to be very small, so -1, -2 per megawatt hour. We felt relatively comfortable with just changing the formulation and setting this floor of $0. So just so everybody knows, that is a change that we've made from the draft final proposal to the final proposal, and we are planning to take that to the Board of Governors when we do that in December. Looking at the 2019 sample data that we reviewed, I think something in the ballpark of about 20 days had negative prices. Again, if you can advance to slide 9 for me, please. And again, these were very, very small in magnitude, usually at -$1, -2. But the ISO, along with a lot of the components of the default energy bid, will continue to monitor, how frequently we do see negative prices, or if we start to see very large negative prices, this could be another reason that could potentially trigger us to reopen this default energy bid and kind of take another look at it to make sure we're getting the right information there. Okay, so at this point, this is all the material that I've had prepared for today. And I wanted to just take a quick pause here for any additional questions, and then I'll turn it over to Jimmy for next steps. and then we will adjourn for the day. So, operator, any questions in the queue?
Someone did just raise their hand. Hi, please go ahead.
Hi, yes, this is Catherine Colbert from Vistra. I have questions on the formulation. Could we go back one slide, please?
Sure.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So we have some general questions about the formulation, and I appreciate the ability to ask them in this venue. So my first question is that, and I guess I should put out there maybe just some background that in addition to the cost that you have included here for storage asset, we consider the grid management charge on both the charge and the discharge side, right? So that fee that is charged to all scheduling coordinators that are operating in the market. For storage, it's a little different because it is anticipated to be on both sides, right? To charge and discharge the full output. I am concerned that the grid management charge isn't in this formulation since it is expected to be an incurred cost. And we respectfully ask the CAISO to revise the formulation to include the grid management charge.
I actually think it is included in the cost. I think we specifically outlined that in the paper. In the event we didn't, I think, you know, we should be including it because it is a variable cost that the ISO recognizes.
That's great to hear. My follow-up would just be to ask if you could double check that it is specified in the paper, and if you could make that clarification, that would be really helpful. If it is, then that's perfect. In addition, yeah, of course, thank you. In addition, just reemphasizing the frequently mitigated unit adder, which would be on the outside of the formulations you have right here, right? So only if only if a resource is mitigated often enough to reach that trigger to be considered eligible as a frequently mitigated unit under the CAISO's tariff, but it would be on the outside of the multiplier, the 1.1. And we're, again, asking for a clarification that the storage is also eligible to, if it is frequently mitigated, to have that adder included on top of the 1.1.
Okay.
And then yeah, no, thank you very much. The next item that I noticed is in the existing formulations that is not being contemplated under this, and I'm really looking just to better understand the variable energy opportunity cost for limitations that exceed a day. While I think it's definitely, there are longer term limitations. If you look at it from the every 5 years or so, there's needed for battery storage augmentation. I think of those as longer term than the daily limitations that we're kind of talking about, of using the opportunity cost to be reserved for the highest periods of the day or to manage the cycling. What I'm confused about is there not going to be the opportunity to request a consideration to be eligible to pursue a variable energy opportunity cost for storage?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand. So it sounds like you're asking, I don't understand the question.
Sure, let me rephrase. I understand that you're proposing an opportunity cost for the daily limitation in the real-time storage step. Today, the CAISO has a limited registration process.
Let me just interrupt you there. There's an opportunity cost component in the real-time storage default energy bid that we've constructed.
Yes, and my understanding is that, and I'm looking for clarity on this, is that the opportunity cost component proposed in the formulation on the slide is representing the daily, an intraday opportunity cost to be available for the 4 highest hours of the day.
Yes, that's what I was talking about, yes.
Perfect. So my question is the variable energy, so the energy opportunity, let me take a step back. Today there's a process where use limited resources can seek a use limit registration, and if successfully registered as use limited, then pursue a process with the CAISO to evaluate opportunity cost adders that are currently included for longer limitations that are on a monthly, yearly, rolling 12 basis.
Sure,
My
yeah.
question is, if I as a storage developer and operator have documentation that can support, let's say, an annual limitation, I'd like clarity that we are still able to enter that existing process.
Yeah, and I think the answer is you cannot do that with a storage default energy bid. If you get a variable cost-based default energy bid, that's the default energy bid that those adders are applied to. It's not this default energy bid. But you certainly could get a variable cost default energy bid, and you can have those adders applied to it. Absolutely.
That's helpful, Gabe. I'll go back and refresh my memory, but my recollection is that the opportunity cost adders themselves are not necessarily, they're not defined within the variable cost option. They're a separate process. And I think we would just respectfully request the CAISO consider making that opportunity cost adder process available on top of the storage dev formulation that you're putting forward.
Okay, yep, we understand that. Thanks.
Great. My last question on the actual formulation of the opportunity cost component in the real-time storage dev, and I believe from your summary of the stakeholder comments, it sounds like others had raised some concerns with how accurate the assumptions might result in, and we've provided an example, but our big picture concern is if the fourth hour, if the value that's selected in that fourth highest hour is actually in real time turns out to be, let's say, the sixth highest hour, then, and the storage resource has mitigated its value at this real-time storage dev, and it's going to be discharged for the first 4 hours, but not going to be available for the hours at the end for 5 and 6 that are really the CAISO's greatest need for the storage to be available. And based on that concern, what we're asking is there any flexibility to revise the opportunity cost formulation to use an average or to use the third highest so that it mitigates some of that uncertainty?
No, at this point, I think the formulation is, we do have a final proposal out on this formulation. I think this is the formulation that we're planning to move forward with. We've also reviewed some data from 2019 and looked at how frequently these things would be mitigated in such situations like you say, like if there were 6 hours of quote-unquote really high prices in the real-time market, how often that would happen. And the answer is, well, not very frequently, which isn't to say that in the future, the mitigation couldn't occur more often because of exactly situations like you say and, increasing tightness in the system. But I think until we, have like an inclination of that happening and a need to update and change this formulation, we're not inclined to do that at this point.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yep, of course. Operator, any other questions in the queue?
Not at this time.
Great. Jimmy, I'll turn it over to you to conclude.
Great. Thanks so much, Gabe. And thanks, of course, Alda and Kathleen for your comments. I really appreciate that. We'll take a look at it. As Gabe mentioned, this is the first step, so we really appreciate your feedback. As Gabe noted, we look forward to your comments on November 12th. We ask that you please submit them through the ISO commenting tool. If folks haven't already registered, you can find that on the stakeholder landing page at kaiso.com. Stay informed, and then you'll see our stakeholder initiatives. And we, of course, look forward to your feedback. As mentioned, the recording will be provided for today with the next few business days. You can look out for that. And, of course, thank you again for your engagement despite current events. And have a great rest of your day, folks.